If you're a defense contractor currently getting ready for CMMC or other cybersecurity requirements, then you're in the right place. My name is Greg Tomczyk, CEO here at Valor Cyber Security, based in Norfolk, Virginia, and really excited about this session specifically. This is a question we get very often, and even more often nowadays as these requirements are becoming more real and they're being asked about, is what does it actually look like to get ready from 0 to 100%? And it's a long, confusing, convoluted process that we feel the industry has overcomplicated. So one of the things after I had my cyber attack in one of my first businesses, and I set out on my mission to improve the cybersecurity industry, but then learn all of the skills I needed to deliver a service that made sense to the leaders who were leading these organizations fearlessly and doing it in a brave way. To start Valor Cybersecurity, I saw how confused defense contractors were when it came to cybersecurity requirements. So a majority of companies, I think there's about 300,000 defense contractors in the US market out there. Probably 75% of those were basically just signing the dotted line to say, yes, we have this in place, or we'll work to get this in place. And nothing ever came from that action. And one of the things I've mentioned multiple times is the government, now that we're this far into it, 2017, we're now in 2025, and now there's a certifiable requirement. But think about 8 years of somebody telling you that they're doing something, you paying them millions of dollars, and then 8 years later, when it actually becomes a requirement, realizing and coming to the realization that they're really not. I think it does diminish trust, and it gets a lot of people from the buyer side, the government side, a little bit angry because they had that trusting those 75% of the companies on their word and what they were signing legally and contractually. So there's a lot of legal exposure here. We won't get into that on this episode. That we can cover that. But today's session is specifically breaking down our 5-step process. We put more than 3 defense contractors over the last year and a half, 2 years through our 6-month readiness program. So there's 2 players in this market when it comes to a company's profile from a service standpoint. So you have the readiness partners that get you from 0 to compliant, and then you have the certifiers, the auditors, the assessors. They're called assessors in the CMMC. But I wanted to break down our 5 steps that we go through in that 6-month program so that you really see how easy it can be for you to get to that 100% compliance and use it as a competitive advantage. One of the things we've also seen companies do is put generic policy and procedure language into their bids and proposals. And all of these pieces of evidence, whenever you go through an audit or investigation, you look for evidence. And typically in that resource plan, you have some type of budget. But where a lot of companies go wrong is they get themselves to a point where they're so frustrated with the confusion that they have around CMMC that they just click the pay for this button, pay for that button, pay for this implementation, pay for that policy, and they look back and they had spent. A lot of companies are still winning contracts even when they don't have this in place. It is still a condition of award, and CMMC is probably going to be in that posture for at least the next 12 to 18 months. As I mentioned before, the proof of compliance is important. We continue to stress that in the market because we get asked all the time, how do you get us ready for a certification in the future by a C3 PAO? The 5-step process, I just want to go over it for anybody taking notes on the call, is going to be scoping, readiness, gap assessment, budgeting, and prioritized implementation, prove compliance through documentation. That proving compliance is so critical, and then continuous compliance. One of the questions we get typically on the end of calls is, how can you help us stay compliant? Because the smartest companies know that these types of implementations are not a one-time activity. It's a continual activity. There's going to be recertifications. There's going to be more questionnaires coming in. So you have to keep this stuff up to date, or it gets outdated, and you start to lose value by the day, by the month, by the quarter that you're not updating. That is our 5-step process. We put more than 30 companies through over the last year and a half, and they've all went through the 6-month program. We lay out these 5 steps in 6 months. We feel that is a healthy timeline because, typically this takes about 6 to 12 months to implement. So if on the forefront of all this, you can make sure you have your scope. This is something that it really affects long-term contract eligibility. We see this as affecting mid and long-term. Obviously, there's a lot of companies we work with that it affects them, in the past and now. But for most defense contractors, they're still seeing this as a long-term effort, and it is something you have to keep up to date. But we encourage folks to get moving in the right direction, get started, get stepping a little bit quicker than you have in the past, because what typically happens, and I hate to see this to companies, is just like like a cyber attack happens when you least expect it. Typically those questionnaires asking for proof on this stuff comes right before funds are being released. And not saying a cyber attack happens at that point, but typically money's involved in a cyber attack. Some type of wire transfer goes out to the wrong person, whether that's $100,000 or $1 million. So when it comes to scoping, I just want to go over each step in brief detail so you know what they entail. Happy to answer any questions that come up throughout this process. So scoping is basically figuring out where the sensitive data, in this case it's called controlled unclassified information, CUI, where that actually flows or sits in your organization, and how we can make sure to minimize that scope as much as possible, because that's going to help with cost, complexity, and help you get compliant quicker. So scoping is that first step. A lot of companies go wrong when it comes to scoping. The government hasn't marked it, so we're not going to treat it as CUI. It's been very clearly identified from what CUI is as a derivative of information coming from any contract or delivering on any contract. We've seen attacks happen all the time. We used to investigate cyber attacks after they happened to contractors for the Navy, for the Army, and they would ask us, where is CUI? Is CUI, at risk or at threat? And we would have to figure out in a quick. FCI is kind of that initial part of the contracting process, which doesn't need to be protected at the level that CUI needs to be, which is level 2. And scoping is so important, so make sure you focus on that first. What objectives do I need to meet? From a business standpoint, most of the people looking at this are going to benefit from looking at the objectives beside the control versus looking at the control and trying to implement it. The objectives really help. That roadmap should get turned into a budget on how much each of those items or how many resources are going to be needed in order to accomplish those objectives, those gaps, those POAM items from the gap assessment. So that's a key step. You scope it out, you do a gap assessment, and that's step 3. We typically get to that in about end of month 2, beginning of month 3. And that's where technical implementation starts. We'll guide technical implementation, and they're basically like, here's all our POAM items, go implement it. And the MSP will have resources that understand this, but if you haven't done the budgeting, they're basically budgeting it for you. And you can get quotes from them, but if you don't have a centralized budget and a centralized kind of playbook of how you're going to tackle this, you're probably going to overspend or underspend and not be compliant. And we want to find that balance. Step 4, proving your compliance through documentation. As that technical implementation is going on, we're documenting everything that is being done, is going to be done, and then putting together the final kind of certification or audit package that is going to basically go to the certifier, that certified third-party assessment organization. That's something that's really benefited a lot of the folks that we work with. And then last but not least, the continuous compliance piece. A lot of companies want to get compliant right now. They want to get to a point where they feel cybersecurity ready. They feel both protected as well as ready to answer the mail when a question comes from a prime contractor or from the government. But continuous compliance is critically important. We see more and more companies coming back to us to ask us, can you manage this for us? Can you help us stay compliant now and into the future? Because they're realizing that if they are compliant already, that people are asking them, like, what's next? How do you continue this? How do you keep this up to date? How do you continue to budget? Who owns this? Those are our 5-step process. That's our 5-step process to what we call CMMC audit confidence. We want to see more confidence in the ecosystem. That's why we put on these trainings each and every week. We want to help you build trust with the market, and this is what this is doing, even if they're not trusting a lot of contractors now, because they're realizing that most of these companies did not have what they said they had in place back in 2017, 2019, and all of the other times that they've asked. We want to help folks understand these 5 steps, and if you get to a point where you've reached your threshold of knowledge and you need somebody to bounce questions off, that's why companies like us, readiness partners like Valor Cyber Security, exist and are here to serve you and make your job when it comes to cybersecurity just a little bit easier. And that's ultimately the mission we're on. So we'll be back next week with another topic. This was our 5 steps to CMMC audit confidence: scoping, gap assessment, budgeting, prioritized implementation, proving your compliance through documentation, which is critically important, and then that continuous compliance piece that's going to keep you compliant, keep you protected, keep you secure, and contributing to national security going forward. So until next time, my name is Greg Tomczyk. Stay safe, stay secure.